inspires me to also describe some of the challenges that we've been encountering in working with social norms. And that's what I'm going to do, alongside a few other things. So firstly, I will try and identify that there are different understandings of social norms, and why I think that's important, that we try and get a bit clearer about both the theory and the practice. And the theory can be, I think it was termed sort of snobbish, and it is a bit, but actually we do need to get to grips a bit with it, I think. Then I'll describe the conceptual framework we've been using to explore gendered norms and adolescence. I'll use the example of early marriage again to describe some of the structural and economic levers of change, and then a few reflections on child protection. And I think the cog that Laurie used does work with this presentation. The terminology may be a bit different, so I talk about society. That's different from the term social that Laura's using, so I have a different understanding of that. But mostly I'll be in that structural area, but not entirely, because I'm going to cover also my understanding of what Laura's talked about, which I find quite difficult, because I'm an anthropologist and I'm not a behavioural scientist. I think we do see the same thing, but we have very different interpretations of what we're seeing and very different understandings that we take away from that. And when I first started using the term social norm, I thought I knew what that word meant. And now I am clearer that I am talking a different language when I'm talking a different language to economists, psychologists, health professionals. I'm talking the language of sociology and anthropology. And we've been doing this Girls Project for about 4 years, and during that we have been developing a conceptual framework, a rolling conceptual framework. And we've explored different meanings of different terms that we've been using, and social norms is one of the areas that we've been exploring. And as we looked into it, we came across many theory and traditions that use this term social norms quite happily. But actually, although some of the definitions were similar, the actual understanding, I think, was different. And in the paper that was circulated, there's a sort of list of about another 15 uses of this term, but I've just pulled out a few and split them sort of into two broad areas. And the first area, the first set at the top, that explores social norms in society in broad structural terms. And those people are really interested in the institutions of power and how that helps shape and define social relations between people. And that's probably what a lot of people would see as a sort of structural area. The second set, they tend to focus much more in terms of how people behave and maintain norms, with a focus on the individual and the group, the reference group, and how they behave given certain conditions at a micro level. But they also expand up into society. So there are two quite different approaches to understanding what a social norm is. And broadly, the sociological tradition emphasises the role of norms in constituting society, in making it up and in governing it, and in governing social behaviour. Whereas the psychological and game theoretical perspectives, which is what a lot of economists use, focus more on why people comply with social norms. That's in the theory that we've been reading, and how that operates. And that's why I've been feeling quite confused when I read what they're talking about. Now I'm going to diverge into some sort of slightly, actually before I do that, this is sort of more in the snobby area of our traditions, but I would like to know how many people here, we've all had some sort of training, we're all professionals, how many people have had a science training, and how many people would see themselves more as social scientists? So quite a lot of social scientists, like me. And I think this is actually quite important because it certainly informs my worldview, it informs my understanding of how the world works. It's not that I don't think a scientific point of view is right, it's just that I enter the world in a slightly different way. And I think this feeds through into how we discuss social norms as well. And this is really, really sort of simplistic and putting people in boxes, and unfortunately people don't stay in their boxes. But importantly, the theory does stay in its box quite often. So the sort of perspective favoured by science and often by economists actually, this approach is much more rational. It assumes people will be rational, that answers can be externally provided. You go in, you collect the information, you understand what the problem is, and you come in with an answer. And it's very useful for science-based truths, and very valid, and a lot of medical research. It is rationalist, it's positivist. And the other approach, which is more sort of sociological, is called postmodern, amongst other terms, and that's favoured by social scientists, and they actually challenge the view that there's a truly objective science, and they suggest that the observer and the observer's standpoint affects what's seen at every level, and reality is constructed by our view of it. So the former tends to deny or be less interested in, and this is a really big generalisation, power dynamics, which is not what you've heard today actually, but generally that tends to be the case. And the latter emphasises power dynamics, and it doesn't see a straightforward reality, but multiple perspectives and understandings, and it will focus more on issues around empowerment and power in society. That's a really simplistic description, but I think that that does inform the sorts of literatures we read, the sorts of literatures we favour, the way we enter the world, the questions we ask, and importantly, how we see change happening. And the social norms debate, I think, is quite full of people coming from quite different traditions. So, again, I am really over-characterising this, but it's helped me to unpack why I was having problems with some of the things I was reading. So behavioural science will approach it in this way. They will focus on the reference group and on changing individual behaviours and group behaviours to trigger wider change. And this is actually the definition that Laurie put up, I think, or similar to, it may not be exactly the same. And in many ways that's focused, that the entry point is through a mindset, how the mind works and how we can change that mindset. This is a definition of social norms from sociology. I will read this because Laurie went into much more detail on the other one. So social norms are group rules for appropriate and inappropriate values, beliefs, attitudes and behaviours. It's actually not so different in many ways, but the reason people conform is different. So they have no choice, no determining agency. That could be a mindset, but it could be other factors, and sociologists tend to look at the structural factors. They can imagine no alternative, and Bourdieu, a very famous theoretician, talked about doxa. You can imagine nothing outside of your reality. Now that also looks like mindset, but actually what he's talking about is the structures of patriarchy and power that keep you in that place. Not about your mindset, but about people operating on you. They will look at people conform because property and asset ownership and power is all outside of your control. It's owned by other people, by the church, by institutions of power. Because women have no voice, no political and economic power at local or national level. So the analysis of why people conform is in a different area. It's in that structural area. Whereas I think behavioural economists tend to look more at the mindset and more at how they can change the individual and the group. And the entry points are different. It's not that the either a right or wrong, it's just that we're looking at it in a different way. So then we come on to when we come from those traditions or those ideas or using those theories, we then look at change. We actually are entering again with a different understanding of how things change, because we have a different understanding of people conform because of different things. No one theoretical perspective of norm maintenance and change is likely to fully capture the range of factors that hold gender norms in place. We're looking at gender norms in particular, or underpin change in a particular situation, and an eclectic approach is likely to be needed. So challenging discriminatory norms requires action on more than one underpinning factor simultaneously. So then we went on to look at bodies of literature about change. And we looked at the drivers of change literature, which is a whole body of work, and it's multidisciplinary. Social norms literature, which is mostly actually, if you look up the term social norm in terms of development and drivers of change, it's mostly psychological, philosophical, economics, game theory. It has some sociological insights, but it's not primarily sociological. We looked at feminist analysis of power, literature around positive deviance, and the masculinities literature. And I think, this is a summary, but the limitations is quite interesting because it helps us to understand why we're not understanding in a way, depending where you come from and what literature you prefer. So the structural box tends to look at the big institutions of society. It tends to be over-dominated by economic drivers, and tends to look less at other sort of structural drivers of change. The social norms theory, as we know, it looks at social convention, rewards and sanctions of maintaining norms, but it really fails to fully consider power relations, and it tends to be abstracted from the analysis of structural drivers. This is talking about the theory and how it's often applied. It's not necessarily talking about what you're hearing here about social norms. The power analysis, that looks at the role of vested interests in maintaining norms. Who has power? Who has a vested interest in hanging on to that? But it also has limitations, as do all the other literatures. So we did this analysis, and I think it was really helpful for us to understand how different people were talking about change in the area of social norms. So these approaches can complement each other, but each has its limitations. It's arguable that power and institutional analysis may not actually consider individual interests sufficiently. Social convention theory and game theory may implicitly treat individuals far too much as free agents who simply need to be persuaded of new norms and practices, irrespective of their wider conditions. And that will ignore the vested interest in maintaining gender order and the differential capacity people have to resist, challenge or change norms, particularly if you're living in poverty. So you may, be working to change people's mindsets, but actually in reality there's nothing they can do about it. So it may change their mind. Girls may well know that actually, I know I can be different from this, but I also know there's no way that that's going to be allowed, because all these people hold power. There's no way I can step out of what I'm expected to do. So that was our learning around starting to develop a conceptual framework over the last year. And I'm going to show you the conceptual framework. And even when I look at this, I go, oh my God. But actually what this tries to do, and if you look at the circles on their own, it tries to bundle together the forces maintaining discriminatory gender norms and acknowledge those different understandings of drivers, which I think are in the real world. So that there are many forces maintaining discriminatory gender norms. And within this, all of this does refer to some sort of theory, actually. But within this, there is the fear of economic and social, the fear of social sanctions, if you like, which we've been talking about a lot in the social norms approach, and that's a lot in the behavioural science approach. But also, it has the interest groups, the cultural and religious and ideological belief systems which uphold and maintain the order in which we live. And so I thought the child beating example was quite an interesting one. It sort of sprung to mind as being something that actually, many people in the UK still hit their children, they beat their children, and they think that's okay. That has changed. And when I think about it, I think, well, is it related to some sort of ideology? Now, as an anthropologist, I think everything is related to an ideology. But it's a weak relationship, that one. It is related to a hierarchy of power in a household and in a wider community. But I think it's slightly weaker. And that is something that I think probably could change, maybe through this sort of social psychological approach, behavioural approach, that you could change people's minds if you just give them some more information. There aren't actually huge institutions of power trying to get people to beat their children. There aren't. In fact, it's the opposite. So that could be quite amenable. But where I think you have a practice where an institution of power is upholding and maintaining that practice, then I think the behavioural approach has much more limitations, and that you have to look at a range of mechanisms, of other mechanisms, and that would be things like social movements, empowering women's groups. It would be economic drivers and looking at, whether that's a good lever of change. There would be other factors that you need to look at. So our theory, our conceptual framework is trying to capture the drivers of change across a wide range of areas, and the critical issue is the problem definition. And I'll come back to that very briefly, but I do think that defining the problem and defining what is the critical driver is really the biggest challenge we have when working in social norms. What is likely to make the most change, and what actually will be quite ineffective. Again, using early marriage as an example, and now moving into the sort of more structural area. We've been doing quite a lot of work on early marriage in a number of projects, and we focused in our 4-year program on what I'll term social norms, it's gendered norms. We focused on early marriage over the last year, early marriage and education. And there's a lot of analysis out there on early marriage. And we know that the motivations and the drivers are very broad-based, really. It may be seen by parents as a strategy for economic survival. It may be seen as a way to protect girls in unsafe environments. It can be related to parental status through kinship, also financial and labour gains, and acquiring reproductive rights. And again, as a sociologist, I would see this as really embedded within a sort of a hierarchy of power with vested interests in this, and indeed in patriarchy. The residence in itself, the very local residence, the girl living with the husband's family, really compounds the problem. Parents being unwilling to invest in a child who will leave the natal home, making returns on their investments low. And of course we know that as a result of that, parents won't send daughters to school. And this is underpinned by some bias and sociocultural norms. And for me, the sociocultural norms and the patriarchy, reflected in sayings like this around the world about the value of girls, and in fact the lack of value of girls. With one son you have a descendant, with 10 daughters you have nothing. The birth of a girl, grant elsewhere, here grant a son. These are all sayings embedded in society. We have them in the UK as well. So this is a sort of really deep embedded tradition, and I don't think you're going to change people's mindset on this. You're going to have to demonstrate a change through other mechanisms. But changing the mindset may also help as part of if you like, a recipe of action. It's extremely strong, undervaluing girls, and this gender bias can drive child protection violations such as infanticide and feticide, as we know, and early marriage. And so changing the value of girls requires action on multiple fronts. Now, economic rationales, in terms of son bias, I think are strongly present, favouring girls being married off. And if you look at the economic rationales, this is much more in the sort of structural box. If you look at a son's lifetime economic contributions and know that that son is going to stay with you, and know that he's going to get a job, or he's going to run the farm, he's going to be bringing in the income, and your daughter, what's she going to be bringing in? Why would you want her to stay? Her economic value is not going to, partly because we don't value women's work, but it's not going to be seen as valuable. Old age security for many, many people is very, very important, and that's why they stay with their son, because they're going to be economically more productive than a daughter. Country-level pension programs in China, when they introduced them, they were found to lower the abnormal sex ratio by about 9%. As people felt more secure, they felt, actually, no, I actually would quite like my daughter here. I don't have to think about just having a son. I can think about having a daughter. 51% of respondents in a fertility service, again in China, identified the primary motivation for a son as the desire for old age support. Again, an economic driver. Sons inherit property. Laurie referred to inheritance. This is really important. If women, and in many countries women and girls cannot inherit, then that's such a devaluing for them, they have no economic value. Dowry and escalating costs also compound the bias because that's very expensive. And of course, as we know, female employment is undervalued, and it's very difficult for girls to get jobs, so their economic value is very low. So we know that education and economic empowerment in this structural wheel is very pivotal to address the social norm of child marriage. Other actions are needed: safe spaces, inheritance law, legal custody rights, basically bringing up the value of women and girls.